Old Testament lesson will be from the 31st chapter of Isaiah, verses 1 through 3. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. Yet he also is wise and will bring disaster, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of evildoers, and against the help of those who work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men, and not God, and their horses are flesh, and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. They will all perish together. And our other scripture reading this morning is from the book of Luke, beginning at the 12th chapter and the 13th verse. Then one from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you?" And he said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?' And so he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many good things laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God.'" Here we are today on this centennial anniversary of the armistice in Europe. And we began this morning by remembering one of the veterans from this congregation. There probably are others that I'm not aware of. But what came to mind for me was the veteran of the Great War, Pastor Trygve Dolly. And Pastor Dolly served this congregation from 1946 to 1951 and returned in later years to live and work among you. Now, I never had the chance to meet Pastor Dolly. I've heard you talk about Pastor Dolly from time to time. And I don't know if it's true, but I remember one time when I was down at the schools in Medicine Lake, and somebody was telling me the story that Pastor Dolly liked to pick up hitchhikers. And after continuing to drive for a few minutes, he suddenly hit the pedal to the metal. And then he'd turn to the person and ask that hitchhiker, "If this car were to crash right now, would you be ready to meet the Lord?" And I thought, what an interesting witness. That is really creative. Now, Pastor Dolly wrote an autobiography, which is an interesting account of his life, and I read most of it. And one of the Navy stories that I remember reading was how, during the war, when he and a fellow sailor had a temporary leave, and this other sailor brought him along, he was just sort of tagging along with him, and this other fellow sailor didn't know what to do with him. He couldn't figure out how to entertain him, because how could Trygve be a sailor who didn't drink, didn't dance, didn't womanize, didn't gamble, didn't play cards, and didn't swear? And this other poor fellow just had no idea what to offer that man, or offer Pastor Dolly. And it doesn't say so in the book, but I only assume that this was an opportunity for Pastor Dolly to share about the things that really count in life and the real joys. So I trust that he took that opportunity. Now here we are thinking about the Great War, as the war was called before the Second World War, because there was no first, there was no second to compare it to. And we give thanks for those who fought and preserved our nation's independence. And we forget sometimes how unique our independence is as a country. And part of the reason that we celebrate is because it's our independence. But there's more to it, because it's the first independence of a country from a European power in the Western Hemisphere. The other nations came afterwards. Haiti in 1803 gained its independence. Argentina, 1816. Mexico, 1821. Brazil, 1822, and so on. The European colonial powers, after they lost their grip for many places in the Western Hemisphere, needed to look somewhere else for colonial rule. And so they turned towards Africa. And the Europeans were able to bring their technological advancements to the continent. And from establishing a presence there, they revamped African society in a manner that procured natural resources, not for the benefit of the people taking them out of the ground, but for the people in Europe. It made the Europeans very wealthy, and it sustained worldwide empires for many decades. By the year 1900, there were only 2 countries in Africa that were not under foreign control. And these 2 nations were Ethiopia, which had been an independent nation for hundreds of years, going way back in ancient history, and then Liberia on the western coast of the continent. And if you may remember from U.S. history, that Liberia was founded as a haven for slaves who had wanted to leave the United States and go back to Africa. So there was a political connection there. The capital of the Liberia is called Monrovia. And so that was safe. But everywhere else had come under European domination. While colonialism had brought great wealth to many countries, there were other European countries who had missed out on the opportunity for economic advancement. Now here Britain and France were the leaders in wielding colonial power. Germany and Italy had just recently become nations, and so they were playing catch-up. Germany and Italy had actually only become countries in the 1870s in the unification of their various states. And while Germany and Italy were trying to catch up with Britain and France, there were other nations that were declining in their power and prestige. Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey. And these 3 weakening nations did not get in on the race for acquiring colonies because they were having enough troubles sustaining peace at home. Now, the Europe of more than a century ago was a delicate balance of power. And to give you a comparison of what it was like, think of it kind of like our American government today, where it's a binary, where there's a 2-party system. And in one little change shifts the balance back and forth. And so on one side you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other side, the Triple Entente, it was called, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. And like I mentioned, Austria-Hungary was one of the weaker nations, and they had many minorities within their borders. Slavic peoples, Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians, Montenegrins, Kosovars, and Serbs. Now, the Serbs had acquired independence from the Ottoman Empire a little bit before that, in the year 1878. And the Serbians thought of themselves as being protectors of the great region Slavic people and wanted to unite them into a pan-Slavic state. A 19-year-old revolutionary named Gavrilo Princip, along with a band of men, assassinated the heir to the throne of Austria, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife in Sarajevo. Now, in response to his murder, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And just like Serbia styled itself as being a protector of the Slavs, so Russia also styled itself as even a greater protector of the Slavs and wanted to bring those Slavic people into a greater Russian empire. And so Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. Now, who was the ally of Austria but fellow German-speaking nation of Germany? So Germany declared war on Russia. And Russia had formed an alliance with France. So then France was drawn into the conflict as well. Well, all the nations prepared for battle. Germany had a double burden, as you might remember from history, because they had a battlefront on 2 sides. And so they strategized, how are we going to be able to fight a war on 2 different sides? And so they came up with a plan. And they decided, we're going to try to defeat France first, and then we'll go over to the Eastern Front and try to deal with Russia. And so the leader of Germany at the time, the Kaiser, he was called. He joked, he said, well, we'll have Paris for lunch, St. Petersburg, Russia, for supper. Now, the Germans couldn't just march straight into France because that border had been very fortified. And so they had to march around through Belgium to come into France. And Belgium was a neutral country. And this outraged the world that a neutral country had been invaded by a country that had the most powerful army in the world. And because of this action, Great Britain felt compelled to join the effort on the side of France and Russia, remembering that they had had that alliance with them as well. And the steps in the war advanced daily, and everybody began posturing towards a fight. And what made the situation even more complicated was that the various monarchs of the countries were related to each other, but yet they found themselves on different sides of the struggle. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, King George of England, and Kaiser Wilhelm were all first cousins of each other. And so they brought these familial rivalries right into the theater of war. Now the Kaiser had developed a type of inferiority complex that came from childhood. The doctors had to use forceps to pull him out. And so one of his hands had become withered, and he had a complex about that. And so to compensate for his disability, he tried to show how tough he was all the time, and he loved to play games of war and dress up in battle. And he would not enjoy playing with the kids until they let him win. Can you see through this conflict the presence of original sin? Can you see how great the struggle was? All the sins are right there. I mean, yes, murder was coming and killing, but we had pride. We had greed. There was trusting in military power instead of trusting in God. It's just amazing to think about when you think of how this war started. Such an unnecessary war, that it was all about posturing and who was going to be the big boy on the block, who was going to be the most powerful, the richest. It was just amazing to think about how sin captivated their hearts. Now, it's said that Kaiser Wilhelm, the one who probably was the most personally unstable of all the leaders, realized what a problem this was, especially with having to fight the war on two different sides. And so he tried to contact some of these other countries' rulers and said, okay, maybe we better just take a breath here. Let's cool down. And everybody said, nope, it's too late. Everybody's getting ready to go to war. This just has to happen. And so it came to pass. Everybody geared up. I mean, former President Theodore Roosevelt volunteered, the hero of San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War, who was a great horseman, volunteered to go help over in Europe training cavalry. And they said, no, thank you. We don't need that anymore. Things had changed. And so sin had just found another creative way of doing its dirty work. The world had changed technologically. In a few decades here, we had airplanes now. We had airplane battles like the Red Baron is famous for, bombs, tanks, machine guns, chemical warfare, including mustard gas, and that sure was lethal. The carnage of the Great War sure sounds like something resembling the book of Revelation, does it not? Apocalyptic, drawing in all these countries, fighting over such sinful things. And it truly became the closest thing probably there is to a hell on earth, if we can use that phrase. If we think on the technology that developed, at the same time, too, the lives of the soldiers was so miserable. Human bodies, advanced over a trench and just gunned down just like that with machine guns. The world had never seen carnage like this before. Death had never had its say like in this conflict. Serbia and France lost about a third of their young men. Can you imagine 1 in 3 of people in your graduating class having passed away from the war? And for those who survived the battlefront, the living conditions were miserable. Dangerous artillery, forced them to dig these trenches. And they spent days in the ground, cold and wet. Their food easily spoiled. There were rats and critters everywhere. Many complained that the worst part of it all was the constant noise of the shelling, day and night. We focus on those who sacrificed their lives, but what about those whose lives were forever changed? Legs and arms amputated, eyes blinded, those who suffered lung issues. And not only did the war affect people physically, but also psychologically. It's from the Great War that we first get the term shell shock, that people had experienced such horrible things. Today, what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Because both sides were entrenched, where gains in territory were measured only in yards. Neither side was strong enough to overtake the other. And the conflict had turned into a war of attrition, where it was basically who would just drop out first, who would lose the war first. But then the stalemate was broken. And Russia, who had originally come limping into the First World War anyway, Russia had millions of soldiers, a big country as we know from the map, a large population, many men in its army. But it quickly grew short of supplies, and popular support for the war faded. Now, Tsar Nicholas II was not a good leader. He didn't want to be Tsar. He was supported in his governing capability, shall we say, by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the church was in complete harmony with the state. And what the state did, the church approved of. They were, basically two arms of the same body. And people viewed the church as being simply an instrument of the state. And because there was discontentment for the state, then there became discontentment for the church. And the Russian Revolution broke out, and the Bolsheviks came to power. The situation became desperate enough that Tsar Nicholas and his wife and family, they were executed. And the communists wanted out of the war. And so Russia quickly signed this peace treaty, and Russia was out then. But the damage was far more than Russia losing its war. The new Russian government had become a country that was not only physically exhausting, but spiritually bankrupt. The Bolsheviks were hardline communists. They followed the teachings of Marx. They were strident atheists who believed that religion was the opium of the people. And the government tore down churches. Christians were forced to practice in private or were even directly persecuted. It was a great loss for the gospel. Here, Russia, a country that had been Christian since about the 900s, it had a millennium of tradition of faith. And now, atheism was the official religion of the country, and they exported that atheism all across the world. If there ever was a lesson for the church, if there ever was a lesson for the church and the state not to get too chummy with one another. Sure, we just went through this election. We want to be involved citizens. We want to make our voices heard. We want to stand for things that are important in life. But it's not the same thing. As Luther taught us, and we talked about that, there are two ways that God works in this world. And we have to remember that God works through the government in maintaining law, maintaining order, restraining evil. And God works through the gospel in saving us and giving us life. So we remember Jesus' words, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so we always have to be so careful that we are involved citizens and taking our responsibilities seriously. But that we're just not rubber stamping either party. I don't care where you are on that spectrum. That we want people to know the church for Jesus Christ and for the gospel. We want people to know about the gospel through our conversations about forgiveness of sins and salvation. We're not a people here demanding that we have certain rights and privileges. At times we might have to speak for those things, but that's not the center of who we are. That's not the core of what it means to be a Christian, that we're just going to establish this Christian nation. No, we are Christian citizens who witness to the gospel in our everyday lives. Now, getting back to the war, and we're coming to a close here. Russia fell, and it looked like Germany was going to win the day. And the Central Powers then could move their forces. German forces could move from the east and focus all their efforts on the west. It looked as if Germany was going to prevail. But then they backed themselves into a corner. Now, Britain had a tradition of having the strongest navy in the world. And you might remember that Britain had colonies all over the world. It said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and that was literally true. Britain attempted to block Germany from its shipping in the North Sea. And to combat this blockade, Germany announced that it would torpedo any British ship. Now, the British at first ignored this, but the Germans were serious. In 1915, there was a vessel called the Lusitania that was hit by German torpedoes. 150 American passengers were killed. Now, this bombing outraged the American media, and greater cries for the United States to finally get involved were spoken. And there's one final thing that tipped our country into entering into the war. Now, there was a German diplomat by the name of Zimmermann. And Zimmermann sent a telegram to Mexico, promising Mexico that if they attacked the United States and started another front on the war, that Mexico would be rewarded with having Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona returned as territory. Now, the Mexicans were smart enough to know to decline the offer because they figured they could not defeat the United States. But the demands for getting into that European war just kept coming and kept coming. Now, the president of our country during the First World War was Woodrow Wilson. And he's not really known for this, but Woodrow Wilson was probably our most Christian president we've ever had. He prayed. He read the scriptures. His dad was a Presbyterian pastor. And as a young boy living in Virginia, President Wilson had helped take care of ailing Confederate soldiers. And so he knew how ugly and how terrible war can be. While many Americans are feeling camaraderie for their fellow English speakers in Britain, Wilson realized that German was the second most spoken language in the United States. So even 2 years into the war, people were demanding, we got to get over there, we got to get over there. But there were enough people that when he ran for re-election, that his slogan, or one of his slogans anyway, was, he kept us out of war. But with the Zimmermann telegraph, things finally buckled. And what convinced President Wilson to enter this war was his hope that because of the great carnage that had taken place, that people would become so disenchanted with war and the search for empire and colonialism that they would never enter it again. And so he proclaimed this war to be a war to end all wars. So it came to pass the American soldiers, named doughboys, finally arrived over there with fresh energy, and within a year they had defeated Germany. And with the entrance of the Yankees, German resistance fell, the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, and an armistice was proclaimed. Now, the powers that be arranged for this armistice to take place, and I mentioned this already in the beginning of the service, on the 11th day in the 11th month of the 11th hour. Many have read into this. What was their rationale for 11-11-11? Was the carnage showing that this world was now in the 11th hour? Were we coming to the end of days? Was this the war that the scriptures had told us to look out for? Now, how soon this world shall end, we do not know. Here we are 100 years even after this fact. But you remember Christ's words, only the Father in heaven knows. But we do know one fact about this whole thing. We know one thing. And that was President Wilson was about as incorrect as you could possibly be when he hoped that this war would be the war to end all wars. Now, 100 years ago, it was common for people to think that the world was progressing, that we were getting better, that civilization was advancing. The technology was going to make our lives better and better all the time. Education was improving. The dignity of human rights was expanding. And all those things may be true to a point, but they have also worked for our harm. The technology that developed took more lives than any other war had in history. The resentment in Germany for its defeat just sowed the seeds for another war a few decades later. While Woodrow Wilson may have been our most Christian president, the fact that he prayed every day, he forgot one major thing. And as we move closer to the coming of Christ, it's just due for us that when Jesus spoke to his disciples, he said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And Jesus said at the close of the age there will be wars and rumors of wars. With the advances of technology, wars will continue to rage. We have no hope of there not being another war in this world, because the prince of this world is not finished with it. And he will do battle, both corporately and personally in your soul, until his time is finished. Now, technology may extend your life, or it may shorten it through warfare. Kingdoms rise and wane. Ideologies come and go. One thing remains steadfast. Repent and believe that Jesus Christ has overcome the world, as he rose from the grave on the third day, He defeated the power of Satan and all powers of this world. He won the only war that will ultimately matter, the salvation of your soul. That's the most important battle there is in this existence. And he won it already for you on the cross. Here, and only here, is there true peace to be found. So as the scriptures say, put not your trust in princes. Do not trust in that you're building up your life to where you're going to have enough money to be able to secure whatever kind of good plan you have for your life. Do not put your hope in that you're going to improve your life. Maybe you've gone on some type of new self-improvement program. Do not think that just because you are a Christian, that this life is going to get easier for you. Do not think that just because you're a Christian, that you will not suffer problems with your health. Remember that as time goes on, that Satan is warring more and more, that his time is coming close to being done. And he wants to make as much trouble as he can. So do not resign yourself to the fact that this world is lost. And do not resign yourself to the fact in the sense that there is more to come in Jesus Christ. That whatever problem you're facing, maybe you've never been close to a battle, maybe you've never picked up a rifle in your life, maybe none of your family members have ever served a military conflict. But do know that Jesus Christ has won the greatest battle in life. And anything you face, any trial that comes your way, any problem that you're facing right now, that Jesus Christ has already procured the victory for you. And all these things that are happening in your life right now, all your problems, all your aches, all your pains, all the death in this world, your loved ones are leaving you, your friends are forsaking you, you've lost your job. These are just all battles that are taking place. But the outcome has already been won. Have joy, take comfort, and know that the only true peace that this world can give you is the peace that Jesus gives. Jesus said, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give as the world gives, Jesus said. Find your hope in the things that last for eternity. Repent and believe, Jesus said, and the victory shall be yours.
Oh, beautiful, for spacious sky, for amber waves of gray, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet, who stirred impassioned stress, a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, none mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in love. shed